The story isn't the protests. The story isn't even the crackdown. The story is how the same set of facts gets packaged into completely different realities depending on who's holding the camera. I'm watching the Iran coverage unfold across Western and regional media, and the narrative engineering is textbook. Same dead bodies, same tear gas, same economic collapse, but watch how the framing transforms the meaning of everything. Here's what we know, according to multiple human rights organizations. Since December 28th, protests sparked by Iran's currency collapse have spread to over 220 locations across 78 cities. Death toll estimates range from 28 to 39 people, with over 2,000 arrests reported by groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. The Iranian rial hit a record low of 1.46 million against the dollar. Iranian authorities cut internet access nationwide on January 8th. These are the receipts. Now watch how they get weaponized. Western outlets lead with crackdown and protesters. Iranian state media leads with rioters and foreign interference. Both sides cherry-pick the same verified footage, but the context changes everything. CNN shows security forces firing at crowds. The narrative is authoritarian oppression. Press TV shows the same footage with different timestamps, claiming protesters attacked first. The narrative becomes justified response to foreign-backed chaos. Neither side is lying about what happened. Both sides are lying about what it means. But here's where the manipulation gets surgical. I'm tracking how news organizations construct timelines to support their preferred narratives. Western coverage emphasizes December 28th as the start date. Peaceful merchants closing shops in Tehran's bazaar. The frame is organic economic frustration escalating naturally. Iranian state media starts their timeline on January 3rd when violence peaked in Malikshahi. Same events, different entry points, completely altered causation. You're not getting chronology. You're getting carefully edited story arcs designed to predetermined conclusions. The mechanism starts with source selection. Western coverage relies heavily on Iran International, a UK-based outlet funded by Saudi Arabia and the human rights activist news agency operating from the US. Not wrong sources, but notice how independent watchdog becomes code for opposition-linked diaspora group when you trace the funding. Iranian coverage counters with official government statements and IRGC press releases. Same technique, opposite direction. You're not getting neutral observation. You're getting curated outrage designed to support predetermined conclusions. Watch the expert rotation. BBC brings on Chatham House analysts who emphasize regime brutality. RT features Moscow-based Middle East scholars who highlight Western interference patterns. Al Jazeera, caught between Arab Gulf funders and editorial independence, splits the difference with both sides framing that actually neutralizes the story. Each outlet maintains plausible deniability about bias while serving their strategic constituencies. The expertise isn't fake, it's selectively deployed. But here's where it gets sophisticated. Look at how death toll numbers are presented. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch cite at least 28 killed between December 31st and January 3rd. Iran International reports 29 protesters killed as of Monday. Notice the precision, not around 30 or dozens. Specific numbers create the illusion of authoritative knowledge when the reality is that nobody can verify exact casualties during active internet shutdowns and media blackouts. The precision is part of the narrative, not evidence of accuracy. The statistical manipulation runs deeper. Human Rights Watch reports 28 deaths in 13 cities across 8 provinces. But that geographic spread statistic serves a specific narrative purpose. It suggests systematic state violence rather than isolated incidents. Iranian officials counter by emphasizing that most casualties occurred in Loristan and Elam provinces, areas with Kurdish and Luri ethnic minorities. Their implication, this is separatist violence, not national uprising. Same numbers, different demographic framing, altered political meaning, and this is where the language engineering becomes surgical. Protesters versus rioters isn't just word choice, it's legal categorization that justifies different responses. Western outlets consistently use protesters even when describing property destruction. Iranian media uses rioters even for peaceful gatherings. The vocabulary predetermines the conclusion. You're not reading news, you're consuming legal briefs disguised as journalism. Visual construction tells the competing stories with mathematical precision. Western feeds show young protesters, peaceful gatherings, security forces with riot gear. The frame says David versus Goliath. Iranian state media shows damaged property, injured security personnel, foreign flags or symbols. Same events, different visual emphasis. Neither side fabricates footage, but the editorial choices shape emotional response. You're not seeing the protests, you're seeing someone's argument about the protests. The camera angle manipulation is systematic. Pro-opposition footage emphasizes wide shots of crowds to suggest mass support, close-ups of individual injuries to humanize victims, security forces shot from below to appear threatening. Pro-government footage shows tight shots of property damage, overhead shots to minimize crowd size, protesters shot from above to appear chaotic. Film school basics deployed for geopolitical warfare. Here's who benefits from these competing narratives. For Western governments, Iranian instability validates sanctions policy and provides diplomatic leverage. For opposition groups in exile, international attention translates to funding and political support. For Iranian authorities, the foreign interference angle justifies crackdown measures and rallies domestic support. For regional players like Saudi Arabia and Israel, Iranian weakness serves strategic interests. The coverage isn't neutral reporting, it's advocacy journalism dressed up as news analysis. But follow the money deeper. Iran International receives funding through complex channels ultimately traced to Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund. That's not conspiracy theory. It's disclosed information buried in regulatory filings. Similarly, several prominent Iranian human rights organizations receive grants from foundations linked to the National Endowment for Democracy, a U.S. government-funded entity. The funding doesn't automatically invalidate their reporting, but it creates editorial incentives that shape coverage priorities. Trump's warning about intervention adds another layer of narrative complexity. His statement that America will come to their rescue if Iran violently kills peaceful protesters sounds like humanitarian concern. But it also serves domestic political purposes, projecting strength without committing resources. Iranian officials predictably denounced it as interference, which reinforces their narrative about foreign manipulation. Both sides got exactly what they wanted from that exchange. The Iranians got evidence of U.S. meddling. Trump got to appear decisive without actual commitment. The State Department's social media strategy reveals the sophistication. Their Farsi-language Twitter account amplifies unverified footage while maintaining plausible deniability about sources. They share videos of protesters putting up stickers with Trump's name while calling it organic expression. The account functions as an unofficial propaganda outlet with official government backing. A technique borrowed from Russia's playbook, but executed through democratic institutions. To be fair, Iran's track record on protest suppression is documented and brutal. The 2022 Masa Amini protests resulted in over 500 deaths, according to human rights groups. The 2019 economic protests killed an estimated 1,500 people, based on Reuters reporting. Iranian security forces have consistently used lethal force against demonstrators. The current crackdown fits a pattern of authoritarian response that's well established and independently verified across multiple governments and NGOs. The hospital raid in Elam province provides stark evidence. According to verified footage from human rights groups, IRGC forces fired tear gas and metal pellets inside medical facilities treating injured protesters. Medical staff were beaten. This isn't narrative construction. It's documented war crime behavior that violates international humanitarian law. Iran's defenders can't explain this away with claims about foreign manipulation or justified response to violence. But here's what the competing narratives systematically obscure. Economic collapse doesn't happen in a vacuum. Iran's currency crisis stems from decades of sanctions, regional military commitments, and government mismanagement. The protests aren't just about political freedom. They're about people who can't afford cooking oil that doubled in price overnight. Yet most coverage treats this as either pure political uprising or pure foreign manipulation, when it's actually economic desperation exploiting political grievances. The sanctions architecture creates specific narrative blind spots. U.S. and EU sanctions target Iranian financial institutions, energy exports, and technology imports. These policies deliberately create economic pressure to generate political instability. But when that instability manifests as protests, Western coverage presents it as organic democratic awakening rather than the intended consequence of deliberate economic warfare. The causal relationship gets erased from the story. Iranian economic statistics tell a story story that neither side wants to emphasize. Inflation hit 42.2% in December 2025. Youth unemployment exceeds 25% in most provinces. Government subsidies for basic goods have been repeatedly cut due to budget constraints. These aren't political problems. They're survival issues that create desperation regardless of ideology. But regime change narratives are more compelling than sanctions consequences stories. The internet shutdown reveals the technological dimensions of narrative warfare. Iranian authorities use deep packet inspection to monitor social media traffic and identify protest organizers. But they also understand that communication blackouts prevent real-time verification of casualty claims and police behavior. Western outlets know that internet restrictions limit their access to ground truth, making their reporting more dependent on exile sources with political agendas. Both sides manipulate the information environment for strategic advantage. Social media becomes the primary battlefield for narrative control. Twitter hashtags like Trial Iran protests and Trial Iran uprising trend globally, but the content is curated by algorithms that amplify emotional engagement rather than factual accuracy. Unverified footage from 2022 gets recirculated as current events. Bot networks amplify specific narratives while suppressing others. You think you're seeing grassroots documentation. You're actually consuming algorithmically optimized propaganda. The hashtag warfare operates with military precision. Pro-opposition accounts coordinate trending campaigns during peak U.S. and European hours to maximize Western visibility. Pro-government accounts counter with alternative hashtags, emphasizing foreign interference and internal stability. Each side deploys sock puppet accounts, stolen footage, and emotional manipulation techniques. The information war is as organized as the street protests. Regional media coverage reveals additional narrative engineering. Al Arabiya, Saudi-funded, emphasizes Iranian regime weakness and potential collapse. Qatar's Al Jazeera, more sympathetic to political Islam, focuses on economic grievances and government responsiveness. Turkish outlets highlight Kurdish minority rights in affected provinces. Same events, different regional interests, customized framing for specific audiences. The escalation pattern follows a predictable script that both sides understand but neither acknowledges. Economic pressure creates unrest. Government crackdowns generate international attention. International attention validates opposition claims and justifies additional sanctions. Additional sanctions worsen economic conditions. Worsened conditions create more unrest. It's a feedback loop designed to produce regime collapse through managed economic warfare dressed up as humanitarian concern. Here's the timing nobody mentions. Iran's economy was already strained from the Israel conflict in June and ongoing sanctions pressure. Trump's return to office creates uncertainty about nuclear negotiations and sanctions relief. European allies are reconsidering Iran policies after the Ukraine war shifted priorities. This isn't random unrest. It's economic pressure reaching critical mass at a moment of maximum geopolitical vulnerability. The market timing is particularly revealing. Currency collapse accelerated after reports that EU nations might seize Russian reserves for Ukraine reconstruction. Iranian officials understand that similar asset seizures could target their holdings if tensions escalate. Capital flight accelerated, creating the exact economic conditions that generate political instability. Financial warfare and information warfare operate in coordination. Oil market reaction tells another suppressed story. Brent crude prices rose modestly during the first week of protest, then stabilized as markets concluded Iranian production wouldn't be significantly affected. The price signals suggest that energy traders don't expect regime change. They expect managed instability that doesn't disrupt export capacity. Economic reality contradicts political narrative. Here's the escalation nobody's discussing openly. If the Iranian currency continues collapsing, the protests won't stop regardless of crackdowns. Economic desperation eventually overwhelms political fear. But if the government falls or weakens significantly, the regional power balance shifts dramatically. Iranian proxies from Lebanon to Yemen lose funding and support. Nuclear negotiations collapse. Migration flows increase. Oil markets destabilize. The consequences extend far beyond Iran's borders. Regional proxy calculations change immediately. Hezbollah's monthly budget drops by an estimated 60% if Iranian currency transfers lose value. Houthi operations in the Red Sea become financially unsustainable. Hamas reconstruction efforts in Gaza face funding shortfalls. Syrian government forces lose Iranian military support. The protest coverage ignores these regional implications because they complicate simple democracy versus authoritarianism narratives. Syrian refugee camps in Jordan and Turkey are already reporting increased Iranian arrivals. Lebanese banks are restricting Iranian account access due to currency volatility. Iraqi militias are demanding payment in dollars rather than reals. The economic crisis is generating regional migration and security pressures that will outlast any political resolution in Tehran. But refugee implications don't generate the same media attention as street confrontations. That brings us to the media's real role here. These competing narratives aren't just describing events, they're shaping international response. If this is framed as legitimate protest against authoritarianism, it justifies Western support for opposition groups. If it's framed as foreign-backed destabilization, it justifies Iranian crackdowns and Russian or Chinese support. The story you choose to tell becomes the policy you choose to support. European policy responses reveal how narrative construction translates into diplomatic action. EU statements emphasize human rights violations and disproportionate force, language that prepares public opinion for additional sanctions. Russian and Chinese statements focus on external interference and sovereignty violations, framing that justifies blocking UN Security Council resolutions. Same events, different diplomatic responses, predetermined by narrative choices. The UN Security Council session on January 6th demonstrated narrative warfare in real time. U.S. and U.K. representatives showed videos of security force violence and cited human rights organization casualty figures. Russian and Chinese representatives showed footage of property destruction and read Iranian government statements about foreign interference. Neither side lied, but neither side told complete truths. Diplomatic theater performed for media consumption. And this is where both narratives break down under analytical pressure. Iranian protesters aren't CIA assets, but they're also not pure democratic reformers. Iranian authorities aren't cartoon villains, but they're also not innocent victims of foreign plots. The reality is messier than either side wants to admit. Economic collapse creates political instability. Authoritarian governments respond with force. International actors exploit the chaos for their own purposes. It's predictable, tragic, and doesn't require conspiracy theories to explain. The coverage reveals how modern media creates the impression of comprehensive knowledge while actually providing selective interpretation. You feel informed about Iran because you've seen footage, read casualty numbers, heard expert analysis, but you're actually consuming carefully constructed arguments designed to support specific policy positions. The information is real. The framework for understanding it is manufactured.
Historical precedent offers uncomfortable lessons that current coverage ignores. The 1979 Iranian Revolution began with economic protests against the Shah's regime. Western media initially supported the protesters as democratic reformers. The Islamic Republic that emerged was far more repressive than the monarchy it replaced. Sometimes successful revolutions create worse outcomes than failed ones, but revolution as progress narratives don't accommodate this possibility. Syria's 2011 protests began with similar economic grievances and democratic aspirations. Western coverage emphasized regime brutality and opposition legitimacy. The resulting civil war killed over 500,000 people and created millions of refugees. Libya's 2011 protests received similar international support and media framing. The country remains fragmented and unstable 13 years later. Pattern recognition suggests caution, but media incentives favor drama over analysis.
What we're witnessing isn't neutral journalism covering organic events. It's narrative warfare using human suffering as ammunition. Both sides present their version as objective truth, while the other side spreads propaganda. The dead protesters and collapsed economy are real. The frameworks for understanding them are weapons designed to manufacture consent for predetermined policy responses. The social media documentation creates false impressions of comprehensive coverage. Dramatic footage of tear gas and chanting crowds suggests complete information, but it actually represents tiny fragments of complex social phenomena. Most protesters go home safely. Most security forces don't fire weapons. Most economic activity continues despite disruptions. The violent exceptions become the representative norm through editorial selection bias. International law provides competing frameworks that both sides exploit. Universal Declaration of Human Rights Article 20 protects freedom of assembly. UN Charter Article 2 protects state sovereignty. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights allows governments to restrict assemblies that threaten public order. Both sides cite international law selectively to justify their positions while ignoring inconvenient provisions. If the coverage needs this much emotional manipulation and selective sourcing to make its case, what uncomfortable truths is it trying to hide? Maybe that economic sanctions hurt ordinary people more than governments. Maybe that authoritarian crackdowns succeed more often than democratic uprisings. Maybe that outside powers care more about geopolitical advantage than human rights. Maybe that successful revolutions often create worse problems than they solve. The story everyone's telling you might be true, but it's definitely not complete.